This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, and welcome in for another episode of For the Good of the Game. My name is John Davis, JD, and I'm your host. I'm really pleased to present another special feature in our series this season. This one is called Host the Hosts 2. For those of you that follow the podcast, you know we had Host the Hosts 1 several weeks ago. And tonight I've got two very special guests. And in addition to being outstanding coaches on the field and court, as well as awesome leaders off the field, these two overachieving gentlemen also each host their own podcast through which they contribute to the education of the larger coaching community, which is something I'm going to talk about tonight. My first guest is Coach Darrin Sheffer. He's the O-line coach and run game coordinator at Brentsville District High School, and he's the host of the Armchair Coaching Podcast on Anchor. And the second guest tonight is Coach Steve Kuchefski. He's the assistant girls track coach and assistant boys basketball coach at Nokesville Valley High School, as well as the assistant varsity football coach at Addison Trail High School. And he is the host of the Coach Steve Show podcast. So I welcome both of you gentlemen to the show tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
You're very welcome. I want to start off, as we were talking off camera before we got started. My theme for this season is relationships. So I want to start out, and Coach Steve, I'll throw the first bone in your direction. Among the many sets of relationships that you engage in, you know, as a coach, administration, parents, players, etc., what do you think has proven to be the most pivotal relationship, either set of relationships or a single series of relationships during COVID specifically?
The kids have been huge to build that relationship, because for me, I took this football job in May of COVID. So May of 2020,
Wow.
I took the job like an idiot, but we didn't know COVID was going to go on like it did at all. And so for me, doing it over Zoom was really hard, but I figured out very quickly, like, just talking to them for 10 minutes was all they needed. 10 minutes, a text, huddle message, whatever it was. So to build that up, and then the summer, I only saw them for 2 weeks. Then we got shut down.
Wow.
So as quickly as I could, I was like, what's your name? What are you about? Like, I talked everything other than football almost. We did our drills, but it was more like, oh, what grade are you in? What do you like to do? And so when the season got rolling back in March, we kind of already knew each other. Like, they kind of knew how I was about and everything. So building that relationship during COVID when I didn't know them was huge. But after doing it for 13 years, I kind of figured out how to talk with. If I was younger, I don't know if I'd be able to handle it.
Mm-hmm.
If I was a young coach, I wouldn't be able to do it. Being an older coach, the worst part was figuring out Zoom. I think that was the worst part, was figuring out all that stuff.
You and me both.
Yeah. But yeah, the kids were more important. No offense to the parents and stuff. I had to build a relationship with the coaches and the kids. That's all I cared about, was getting that done.
Well, I think clearly most of the guys I've talked to have certainly revolved around the athletes if they have not focused solely on them. But Coach Sheffer, did you find much difference in your situation?
No, not much difference. And I've always been it comes to the kids first. And I've had that as a teacher as well as a coach. And it's all about the relationships with the kids. And Coach Steve mentioned a little bit, the relationship with the coaches. The communication is key. This year, for me, I had been at this school for 2 years before as the linebackers coach. Okay. And so I was transitioning from defense to offense this year and becoming the offensive line coach. And so a lot of the offensive line kids I had not necessarily worked with one-on-one. And so I needed a lot of communication with the older offensive line coach, or the former offensive line coach, I should say. I shouldn't say older. The former O-line coach, saying, hey, what did you see in this kid? What did you see in that kid? You know, what do you think is going to happen? Also had to have a clear line of communication with the offensive coordinator, because as the O-line coach and the run game coordinator, I'm basically teaching all of the run schemes. And so coming from defense to having to learn the offense, I have to have a clear line of communication with the offensive coordinator. And then I didn't have to deal with it personally, but our head coach had to deal with making sure that we were communicating things clearly with the parents. And our head coach is someone that we would consider an over communicator. meaning he probably talks a little too much, but he was very good at making sure the parents knew every detail of what was coming out, what was happening next, why we did certain things, why we followed certain protocols, that sort of thing. And being around that really makes you understand, hey, you have to have you have to have a relationship with everybody, not just the parents, not just the other coaches, even someone like the athletic trainer, making sure that we're all on the same page. And I know of all the coaches out there like, well, this is nothing new. Well, trying to deal with COVID at the same time, that's new. And so clear communication between everyone was the biggest key for us.
Yeah. I found it interesting with all the guys that I've spoken to and broached that subject. While there were many different answers in terms of the specific relationships, everything revolved around communication. And, as a bit of an over communicator myself, I value one thing. And what I always tried to do with coaching is focus on the athletes and manage expectations with the parents. I think the biggest thing is, and especially, of course, in youth football, it's not a big deal. But once you get into junior high and certainly into high school, now you start to get parents to start to gripe about playing time or what are you doing this way or that way. And I've always found being proactive in managing those expectations helps cut down a lot of fences sometimes. So when, just out of curiosity, switching from defense to offense, did you find that gave you a little bit of an advantage in being the run game coordinator because you understood the defensive schemes you'd be going up against?
Absolutely. My first year, I should say my second year coaching, I was given the opportunity to be the head freshman coach at another school that I was at previously. And, being a young coach, I thought I knew everything. Well, I knew nothing about defense. I knew nothing about defensive scheme or different fronts. I didn't understand all of that. And so obviously our offense struggled that year and we did not do very well. Spending 2 years on the defensive side of the ball, helping out with the scheme on the defense and understanding, okay, well, this is why this guy's here. This is why we line up in a 3-tech here, understanding how gap sound defense works. That way I can watch how other offenses will attack our defense and understand, okay, our defense has certain weaknesses at this point here. When we come out in our four down front, we have a weakness in like the backside B gap, things like that. And so coming from that side of the ball for 2 years straight of doing nothing but defense, absolutely, it made me a better run game coordinator because now I understand, okay, they're lining up here because they're trying to do this. Their weakness in a 33 stack, their weaknesses in the flats. I'm not trying to give anything away there, but every defense has a weakness and you can figure it out.
Sure.
And I was actually partially being trained to be a co-defensive coordinator at the time. And so I was getting even more of an instruction in how to do defense than a lot of other defensive coaches may have been. And so absolutely that gave me a better advantage because now as the offensive line coach, I look at a defensive front, I look at an over front, I say, okay, well, we should attack right here because we can get good angles here. We can get a running back up the middle, maybe run quarterback ISO or something. Coach Steve loves that. We talked about that on his podcast. It definitely gives you a better advantage. And if there's people out there who are offensive coaches who have never coached the defensive side of the ball, highly recommend that they really need to go to that side of the ball for a while and do just defense for a while.
I do too. In fact, I absolutely, especially for guys that start out in youth football, because it's a great time with very little pressure to be able to learn and make mistakes. And besides the fact that at the youth level, you also have to overcome the hurdle of your kids being inexperienced. So you really have to coach that much harder. Coach Steve, you've got a variety of interests in terms of your coaching palette, doing girls track and field and boys basketball. What do you take from those other sports? Coach Kenny Simpson recently just published his book and I loved it. Coach coach football like a basketball coach. And it was a great book. What do you draw from those other sports and how you interact with those athletes that you apply to your football team?
Well, when I had Kenny Simpson on too, and he had just come out with that book and then he mails it to me. And I said, it's funny because I'm even when I coach offensive linemen, I talk in basketball terms, kind of basketball kids. And so you have to say it in a basketball term for them to understand it.
Makes sense.
So I take that so I can, there's some basketball players that are football kids that probably shouldn't be playing basketball. So you take the football terms and bring it to them. But then like he even said, we talked about it, basketball is very simple and you can look at a football kind of like you do basketball. But I quickly found out coaching girls, they don't complain as much as boys. And so girls are there to get better all the time. Some boys are like, what have you done for me lately? Especially in high school. Girls just want to get better. They don't complain. I've quickly figured that out with girls throwers. I just like building the relationships and helping them grow in every sport because every sport has a different mentality. Every sport has a different terminology. I love it. I hope that answers this sort of answering the question, but like it's a different gear shift. So you do football into basketball, different gear shift, different things you can do, but you take planning basketball practices into planning football practices. Like, okay, in basketball, you don't have so much time. You play all these games. How do you make practice simple? Take it to football. Track, you're looking at mechanics a lot because of throwers. You're looking at mechanics, sprinters and jumpers. You're looking at mechanics. Well, how do I take looking at mechanics over to football and this, especially all the rage is the speed-based training.
Sure.
How do you look at mechanics into this? So I think coaching each sport, like football, you're looking at power and strength and all that. Basketball, you're looking at hand-eye coordination, footwork. Track, you're bringing in mechanics. So you just bring it all together and use it for each sport. For me, because this is my second time coaching 3 sports. It's very draining, especially during COVID when we had 3 going on. I did 3 in one day. Like we had them all going on at one time. And so I would be in bed at 8:30 at night. Like it was just, I'm done. I'm going to bed. But I think you could take all those things from each sport and take it to each one, to football, to basketball, to track. So I recommend people to coach at least 2 sports if they can. I know some people like Coach Sheffer has a family, can't do it. I have a dog and that's it. So I can do these 3 sports. But I recommend doing more than one sport. We tell these kids to be multi-sport. I think coaches should also be multi-coaches as well.
Yeah, I recommend that as well. I know I used to do an indoor track club here locally. Had the blessing of having a guy locally who was a good friend of mine who was actually at the time we started, he was the current gold medal holder in senior Olympics in the 100 and 200. He ran a 12 flat 100 meters at age 55. And wow. We applied a lot of that crossover that you're talking about. And I love Kenny's reference to how in the book, he paints it all scheme based. And, you can just like in basketball, because it's so fast and you go from offense to defense, you teach schemes. Well, that same thing applies in football. So I want to kind of go into a little bit. And if you would, Coach Sheffer, that, obviously, and Coach Steve just mentioned, having a family. I grew up in the military with 4 kids. And Coach Steve, to your point, in the year 2001, I was coaching 3, but it was all football. But I had a 7 and 9-year-old flag team, a 10 to 12-year-old tackle team. And then I was the volunteer defensive coordinator for the freshman team at the high school. So I feel your pain. When Coach Sheffer, when you look at your family life, your normal job, your workload, what motivates you? I mean, I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but I mean, you're through 80 episodes in your podcast and you're pretty prolific in terms of, getting these guys on, talking with folks. What really motivates you to do that?
Holy cow. Is it really 80 episodes already? I haven't even counted. What motivates me in football is just my love of the game. I just love the game of football because of what it has done for me as a person. There were so many lessons that I learned through playing high school football. And even though I was not a, superstar in high school, I never was. I was okay. But the lessons that the father figures I had in my coaching staff taught me have resonated to this day. And there's multiple coaches that I pull from that I kind of I took their lessons to heart and I use them in my coaching. And so that really motivates me because of what I was able to learn and what football was able to do for me as a kid. I want to replicate that for my players. I want to replicate that not only for my players, but I also try to replicate that in my own way in my classroom. I had amazing teachers all through school. I had some who weren't so great, but I had mostly amazing teachers. And some of the best ones I try to emulate. I try to, with my own style, I try to take those leadership lessons that they taught me, and also like the passion, because I'm a big science nerd. That's what I teach. I teach science. And so I try to be passionate about what I teach, even though, in earth science, sometimes we have to talk about rocks, and no offense, rocks aren't that sexy, but you got to bring the passion. And once you do that, the kids see that and they're like, oh, he really likes this. Maybe I should look into it. And so that really motivates me in the classroom more so than standardized tests or anything like that. As a teacher, like I could honestly care less about standardized tests. For me, it's about seeing those kids becoming passionate about just learning and life in general. And then family wise, I'm just passionate about my family. I want to do the best that I possibly can. And so I understand that every day that I go to work, every day that I go out on that practice field, I'm representing my family, not only the family that raised me, but the family that I have created with my wife. I'm representing them. And so I have to represent them to the best of my ability, just so that, one day when I do pass on, everyone has good memories of me, but they also have the lessons that I was able to teach them. And hopefully when my kids are a little older, my son's 4 years old, my daughter's 1 year old. And so right now they're not really listening to me yet. Hopefully when they're a little older, I can start teaching them those same lessons that I learned from everyone else. And that's really what the passion that drives me. Now for the podcasting, I'm going to be honest with you, Coach. I started doing the podcasting because I was bored. And I really loved, I love listening to podcasts. I'm not a person who likes to listen to the radio on the way home or on the way to work. I listen to a podcast, or I listen to a book on tape. You can call me boring all you want, but that's what I listen to. I like to learn. Now I always liked the Joe Rogan podcast, and Coach Steve, we've talked about that before, but I really got it. I'm not sure the listeners may know about, the Football Coaching Podcast with Joe Daniel, who's he's also from Virginia. He's from the Richmond area. I still listen to his podcast, and I really loved what he was doing. And I was really missing, and the thing that I try to emulate with my podcast as much as I can, I was really missing that camaraderie that you have with your coaching staff. Like, the after practice, in the coach's office meetings that you have, or the after games meetings where you just kind of have that banter, and that I really missed that. And I tried to emulate that. And I've made some pretty good friends over Zoom who I've never actually met face to face, like Coach Steve. I have you on my phone in my text messages, and we've never actually been face to face to each other, never been in the same state together. But I've met a lot of people along the way, and I kind of use my podcast as it's a platform to get knowledge out there. Because when I was young, I'm sorry for the long-winded answer, but when I was younger, I knew nothing about football, and I was like, how do I learn, more? And I eventually found Twitter, which eventually opened up a wide world of football knowledge. And I try to share what I'm learning from these coaches with everyone, and provide a platform so that everyone can learn these lessons. And I kind of treat it like a lot of coaches say when you go to a clinic. If you could take one little piece of information from each clinic that you go to, it was worth it. I try to do the same thing. I'm always taking notes when the other coaches are talking. I'm always like an active listener, asking questions. I know Coach Steve has gone to a less scripted version of the podcast, which I enjoyed being on his podcast the other night. Mine's a little bit more scripted because I'm trying to target certain topics. But I have been trying to be less super structured, if that makes sense. Sure. Because I'm trying to allow the conversation to flow, naturally instead of forcing it in a certain direction. And I know that was a long-winded answer, but those are the many different things that really drive me to keep going.
No, I appreciate each one of those. I think that, we all have our kind of a central why, probably, is why guys get into coaching. And I certainly have one driving me right now, but I completely understand. So Coach Steve, you started the show in February 2020 with a great pilot called Why Can't We Be Friends? And I've actually got a question that I'm going to get to later on that centers around that. So I'm not going to dive into that right now, but in addition to kind of a diverse array of football specific topics in 132 episodes now. I mean, that's crazy. You've covered everything from WandaVision to Fighting Illini basketball. I love the diversity and all. So what fuels you in your search for variety with regard to the podcast itself?
Well, I think I'm the problem because I started that, and then I started the podcast because I love like the Pat McAfee show. I love Pardon My Take, and I love talking sports. I love getting debates. So I was like, let me start a podcast. Maybe I'll bring friends on. We just talk about, like, me and my one friend. I'm a Michael Jordan fan, and he thinks LeBron's better, like that type of thing. And then COVID happened, so there was no sports. So I took the blame for COVID. I was like, I start this podcast, and then COVID happens. So the original title of the podcast was the Sideline Podcast with Coach Steve. That was the original name because I eventually was like, well, let's not do the sports. Let's do football. And that's kind of how it started was I'm just going to do football. It could be all football coaches. Same thing with Coach Sheffer. I think I'm a little bit older, like 2 years older. There was no go to Google and type something in and all this stuff pops up, at least not for me. We had dial-up. Anybody that listens, AOL dial-up. There was no looking up football stuff. So Coach Sheffer inspired me to get people on because he started like a college football stuff. Like we come on and talk. That's how we met coaches. We come on and talk. I think Clemson was the first one. So that motivated me to get people on. So Coach Bennett, shout out to Coach Bennett, he was my first guest. So then it just turned to football. Well, then I figured out I like to talk about things other than football. I like to talk about WandaVision. I like to talk about Marvel. I like to talk about anything else. So I thought I'm kind of stuck with just football because of the title, because of the theme. So I changed it to the Coach Steve show. Then it just opened it up where I said I could talk to basketball coaches, football coaches. One of my friends growing up back home, he loves movies and TV shows. We call it Geek Corner. We're like, let's just call it Geek Corner. So we come and talk about Marvel, DC. Me and my two friends from back home, every Sunday we do a live show, quote unquote, on YouTube where we talk sports most of the time. Sometimes it's BS, but it just turned into that. So I ended up doing what I originally wanted to do was let's talk sports. Let's have these debates.
Sure.
But like Coach Sheffer said, I wanted to give, he's had a couple of coaches say this to him, and I've had this. Coaches will say afterwards, I'm a nobody coach, and you just gave me this platform for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, just to even give my side of how we do things. And that means everything. Like, I'm a nobody coach. So I'm like, if I can give somebody even a platform for 20 people to listen to him, even if it's just that, it means it. And so I had a lot of fun doing this. You get to meet people, you build these relationships, and they're there for you. I remember 2 coaches have already offered me jobs, but I have to move to California. And I'm like, that's all right. But you build those relationships. And what motivates me is to do that. It was wanting to do sports debates, then it turned into football. Then I've just went to this variety of, like, I think it was Coach McPherson. He does on YouTube. I had him on, and that's kind of what started the unscripting. Because me and Coach Sheffer messaged back and forth. This is my long-winded answer. We would message back and forth like, okay, how are you going to talk to coaches? And we just said, like, okay, what kind of questions are you going to ask? And I would tell him, I ask him the same thing. So we're helping each other out. If we talk to a coach, we'll message each other and say, hey, go talk to this coach. He's really cool. He'll talk to anybody. Like, we try to help. I figured out that I'm horrible at, like, interviewing. So I was like, I can't be so scripted. I'll have a couple questions, then we just go off of it. Then when I got to Coach McPherson, he was like, Steve, I draw on a whiteboard every day. I have my own YouTube channel. We can talk about anything. We can talk about football, but we can talk about other things. So we talked about WWE. We talked about Metallica. We talked about golf. And talking to him said, Steve, do you think you're smart enough to hold a football conversation and go off of it? And I said, I think so. He goes, just do that. You talk about something other than football, great. And then Coach Bancher said, if you ask a guy to be on your podcast, if they want to talk about a topic, talk about it. If they don't, just talk. So I like to consider myself the sports Joe Rogan. I just go with it. I hope I get to 20 million listeners, but that would never happen. But so I'm a nerd. I like the WandaVision stuff. I like talking about other things other than just football all the time. So that's kind of where the diversity came from. It might have scared some coaches away because I think it was just coaching. So listenership had gone down at one point because I think they were so used to the football side of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be a hump to overcome. But then I decided, I think it was Coach McPherson again. He was like, well, how many episodes do you have? I was like, I don't know. So that's when I had to go back and number all of them. And at the time it was like 86. He was like 86 or something. So I had to go back and that's why I realized I'm just going to start numbering them. So if I ever get that question, I know. So like Coach Sheffer was 132. I was like, oh my gosh, 132? That's crazy. And because every Sunday I do a show and that's considered one.
Right.
But yeah. And so it's been crazy.
That's kind of cool getting some of that backstory. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I'm hoping not to stop. I slowed down a lot because of coaching, but I hope to not slow down in the summer.
Well, let me give you an interesting stat that I just heard recently. There are about 1.7 million podcasts currently listed as active, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 75% of those have not put an episode out in over 3 months. So if you're consistent, you will eventually get there. I didn't do this for listens or follows or downloads or anything like that. I did it because, in fact, I won't go quite as far as Coach Sheffer did. I was bored, but that wasn't necessarily the motivating factor as much as it was. I felt like I could fill a void and share some with, not necessarily my knowledge, but other guys who had a lot more knowledge than me. And that's why I started out with, football insights and life skills. Because the reality is, whether you talk about ESPN, or the app, or whether it's other podcasts, a lot of guys talk X's and O's, and that's good. It really is. I just didn't want to do that. And probably one of the coolest things I think we're sharing is I had one coach on from here in Kentucky, and he shared that it's been interesting to him that during the pandemic, he connected with, I think it was 5 to 7 other coaches, and all from different states. And they have, some of them started back in the spring, started playing again, and they have actually traveled to each other's games, and they talk once a week. None of them are ever going to compete against one another, at least not right now. And I thought that was really a cool deal that came out of the pandemic. So when, Coach Sheffer, you talked about, actually, I one thing I thought was kind of cool, where you started, because you actually started doing your podcast with after the pilot with Power 5 profiles. You were doing program profiles, and I'm a lifelong Alabama fan. So I love the fact that, there you go.
We covered them too.
Yeah, I saw that in a later episode, but I know you started off with Clemson, and I saw Army was in there. So there was a lot of different variety in terms of programs. What have you used in your selection process as far as your topics and stuff for show notes when you've gone, when you start looking ahead and saying, I want to do these different topics?
I was a lot like Coach Steve, where I just wanted to talk football, and I'm a huge college football fan. Like I like watching the NFL, and I really got into it a little bit more recently when I started doing fantasy football, which can be a little distracting every now and then. But I love college football. I love the passion behind college football and just the debates. If you listen to ESPN and when they talk about, the who's going to make it to the college football playoff every year, or before it used to be who's going to be the top 2 for the BCS. And people would get on there and they would just debate, it's always Kirk Herbstreit and someone else, always debating. And it's always Kirk Herbstreit predicting Texas is going to be there, and they never do. So, stuff like that really brought it into it. And when we first started choosing programs to talk about for the program profiles, which I'm hoping to bring back because we haven't done one in quite a while. We got to get the band back together. What I started choosing it based on who were like the biggest programs out there. You know, who would like, if we did Clemson and then we talked about Alabama, Ohio State, you know, those are like the big three right now. You know, people would listen because that's what everybody wants to hear. That's what they consume, right? And so we did, Clemson was the first one. I think we did Ohio State later on. And I think Ohio State was one of the first ones where we had a legit argument go on in the middle of the podcast between two coaches. And then from there, I started getting a couple of guys who wanted to come on solo. I think actually it was Coach Bennett's episode. I listened to his. I was like, maybe I should get some guys on by themselves and do that. And so I started doing that, and that's actually became the basis of the podcast from now is just providing the platform for those coaches. But I really want to get back into it. And recently, we went through the SEC, didn't we, Steve?
Yeah, we did like LSU, Auburn, Alabama, Mississippi State. We went through a lot.
Yeah,
I noticed most of the SEC on there when I was looking through your show profile.
And then they tried to get me to do a triple option where I took the abuse of how much.
Well, we did that one because I'm a huge Service Academy fan.
Okay.
And I love triple option football. And Army's currently my favorite. And so I always watch Army whenever they play. And so I was like, we're going to talk Army and Navy. We're going to talk about it because I want to talk about it, you know? And then it got to the point where I was using Twitter a lot. So I was trying to get the fans involved. It's like, hey, you know, what conference do you want us to go through next? And so they vote. And I think the next one that we're going to do is the Big Ten. And so since we've already done Ohio State, we probably won't do them again. Maybe we'll start off with Michigan and talk about why Michigan's terrible. But I know Flexbone 101 is going to get after me for saying that. But
he's fine. He's
Coach
been on my podcast twice.
And so really the basis behind those program profile episodes is trying to get a group of us together and in a little bit less of a professional environment, just debate a college team. You know, when the first few episodes, I was scripting everything, like every single question.
Mm-hmm.
I would script like which coach said what, when, and it got kind of stale after a while. And it was very hard trying to script all of that out.
Sure.
And be fair. But it kind of boiled down to myself, Coach Steve, Coach Bennett, and Coach Banstra were the main four who would come on pretty much every night and talk about it. And then we had Coach Heath, who is now the co-host and also the producer of the Armchair Coaching Podcast. And so he comes on quite a bit as well. And I just enjoy talking with the guys. You know, it's almost like having a second coaching staff that you can debate stuff with. And we always shoot ideas off of each other. You know, us, you know, Banstra, Coach Steve, and myself, who we all three have podcasts, so we talk about podcast stuff. And you know, Banstra's gone through the atmosphere with a number of episodes that he's done and coaches he's had on and the clinics he's done. I don't know when he sleeps, but you know, because he has a family too, and I have a family, and I'm sitting there like, there's no way that I could. I mean, I guess I could if I didn't want to sleep at night, but
yeah, it's one thing when you go to scroll down his YouTube channel and you sit there and go, you know, you're dragging that scroll button down repeatedly, and he's got just a ton of episodes. He
edits them all himself. That's the biggest thing. Wow. I don't edit my episodes myself. Coach Heath is the producer. He does all of the editing. And so I just shoot him all of that stuff after we record, and he sends it back, and I put it up on Anchor, and then it goes out to all the different podcatchers and stuff. He does all that himself. I have no idea how he does it. You know, it's tough enough for me to just download the episodes and send them off to Coach Heath. Well, you know, we're not really making a whole lot of money off of it.
Well, it's funny you bring that up. I had never intended to monetize mine. I was in it for the long haul. Now, this new one that I'm going to be doing that I was talking about before we came on, I am going to. It's got a little bit broader base, and I think it will. It'll catch a little more wide swath, if you will, as opposed to what I'm doing with this podcast. But it's interesting. You guys both brought, talked a little bit about one way or another about listenership. It's really crazy. I honestly thought that when I started, I went through, I had 45 guys that agreed to do episodes before I ever recorded my first one. And there were a few Hall of Famers in there, some very well-known guys. One of my early podcasts was Billy White Shoes Johnson. And, I've been friends with him for a number of years, but the single most watched episode that I've ever had, I had Kenny Simpson, and there's a coach here in Kentucky who has like an 86% win percentage. He's been coaching for 46 years. I think he's won 5 out of 6 state championships in the last 6 years at his school. And we did that live stream. I have a buddy who produces sports here, and during COVID, he had no sports to produce. So he was doing live shows. And that show with the coach, with Kenny and the coach from Kentucky, we had almost 10,000 people tuned into that show. And that blew me away. So a lot of times it's not having somebody who is Coach Steve. You made the comment, you get, some, maybe a quote, nobody coach will say, hey, I appreciate the platform. A lot of times it's not the name that draws people. It's either the topic, the engagement, it could be a number of other things. And I've had some shows that surprise me. A lot of times it's the fact that you have a guy on who has a very large following or huddle in his own program. And that's been the case a couple of times for me, where I've had high school coaches on that just have massive followings because they've been coaching for 25 or 30 years. So let me ask you, I want to kind of transition to another question that I've actually asked a lot of guys this year, and it's an interesting phenomenon, but I'm an old school guy. I'm 62 years old, and I coached for a little over 22 years altogether, including high school. I've not coached above high school, although I did play in college before I joined the military. So when I played, my experience was coaches that I had as a player and coaches that I was working with, particularly at the high school level, guarded everything, kept everything very close to the vest. And one thing that I have noticed since I started podcasting and seeing guys like yourselves, seeing guys like Kenny Simpson, and I could fill in the blank with a ton more guys. We just talked about Nick Banstra. His channel's unbelievable. What do you think is kind of behind this all of a sudden, this willingness to share? Not that everybody does it, but it's a lot more open than most people. And Coach Steve, since you started with the pilot talking about why can't we be friends, I'll let you attack that one first. What do you think has contributed, or do you think COVID has really been kind of the catalyst behind it?
I would say COVID has something to do with it because we were all at home. We had nothing to do. People started doing Zoom clinics and this and that. But I think even before COVID, I think this is no offense to anybody. I don't know about you guys going to clinics. It just seemed like coaches were still keeping things to themselves. Not everybody. I mean, some of these Glacier clinics, there were some of those coaches that were like, let me show you what I did with 8 Division I Alabama players. Like, okay, I get it. Like, they were really good. But then you had some coaches like Coach Dearman. Coach Dearman will give you the secret sauce to things. Like, he'll tell you. So I think even before COVID, coaches were tired of seeing that type of coach and said, well, why don't I just tell people what we do? Because I think we all kind of realized, like, I could tell you exactly what my playbook is. Here you go. But you have to realize what I'm calling, and you got to figure out how to stop it. So I think a lot of us coaches that grew up with not being able to find things on Google, we had to go read books. We had to go read magazines. These kids don't even know how to trade film. I remember my first year coaching, you had to go trade. It was a DVD. That was when DVDs came out. We had to drive and trade them. You didn't do huddle. So I think even before COVID, I think some coaches were tired of high school coaches. They were tired of seeing big time coaches, quote unquote, say, keep things to themselves. It's not fully gone away. You still have coaches out there that say, well, I'll tell you this little snippet, but you got to pay $1,000 to find out the rest. So it's still there and good for them. They're smarter than me to figure that out. but I think it started and then COVID ramped it up. Like Coach Banster, I had him on the podcast a week or so ago. I asked him that question. I said, "Do you sleep?" He goes, "About 5 hours." He goes, "I'll wake up throughout the night though. It's fine. Energy drinks, I'm good." I said, "Okay." So I think it was both. I think it was just coaches tired of seeing coaches keep things to themselves and not grow the community. And then COVID just ramped it up. I think it was starting that way. And then when COVID hit, it was, well, what else are we going to do? Let's start podcast shot through the roof.
Absolutely.
It kind of started right before I started it. Then Coach Sheffers took off. Then I started doing it more. Coach Banton, all of a sudden, everywhere you looked was podcast, which is fantastic because it was just different things you could listen to and take things. Then Coach Banster's clinic shot up. Chief Pigskin from Nate Allball, Coach Allball, his shot up. So I think it was just a mixture, and like COVID does, it just ramped it all up. And now I think people are realizing, like, oh, all you have to do is ask somebody, and they should be able to tell you. Like, if someone asks me a question, I'll just answer it. Not saying I'm smart, but like other coaches, you send them a message. How do you block inside zone? Oh, they'll just tell you. They're fine with it. So I think it was just a mixture of both. And thank goodness, because I can't afford $1,000 to figure out what they're doing. I got to figure it out. I want to figure out the freeway or something.
Yeah, Darrin, do you think that what you described yourself as earlier is something that I value tremendously, because in my old age, I finally figured out that I wanted to be a lifelong learner, is basically what you described. And by the way, I have 2 of my 4 kids are teachers. So, I appreciate what you do, and all coaches who choose to teach. I know a lot of coaches just coach, and that's fine. But do you think that this willingness is kind of a reciprocal effect, maybe, of guys like yourself who like to continue learning and maybe thought, well, shoot, if I like learning, there are people always say, if you want to receive, you got to give, or the more you give, the more you receive. You think a little bit of that worked out?
Absolutely. There's a lot of people out there who, I think the last couple of years, we still had that, old school mentality. Like, I'm not telling you what we're doing, because then you'll know what we're doing, and we might play each other one day. But everyone had a, secret sauce, or, a secret offense or something like that, the secret handshake of the wing tee, that kind of stuff. But there are no secrets anymore. And I think we saw the last couple of years, in my opinion, a couple of guys who have influenced me media wise. Chief Pigskin, Coach Allball, Chief Pigskin, huge with sharing his information. The first thing that I noticed, one of his biggest things that really got him started, was his Film Friday episodes. I loved Film Friday. He was willing to show his huddle film and talk about it and be vulnerable and open to criticism and comments from other coaches. And that, I think a lot of people started seeing stuff like that. And then you see people, have success selling their systems. You bring up Coach Simpson. He's had a lot of success selling his gun T system. In fact, speaking of that, I do have his book right here next to me in my little coach's area.
Absolutely.
And so, and I think you see a lot of that, and you're like, well, if they're having success doing that and they're sharing all of their information, well, why can't I do that? I might have something to share, and in return, maybe I share like the way that I've done something, and maybe it's a drill that I've done, and another coach might say, hey, I've done something similar. Maybe you could try this. And then you try it and you're like, holy cow, this is so much better than what I've been doing. And that's where coaching Twitter has exploded. Everyone shares everything on coaching Twitter, and sometimes they overshare. If someone's feeling really frisky, they'll start sharing their entire system, and they'll talk about, well, we do it this way, and then other people are like, well, you're dumb because we do it this way. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but I think it's every coach wants to feel like they're original, if that makes sense, and they want to put information out there that they believe other people don't have, which is kind of baloney because nothing is new in football anymore. There's no new innovation. Everything is, we're stealing it from other people. We might mesh a couple things here or there, or, change a thing here or there, but there's nothing new. RPOs, they're not new. They've been around for quite a while. It's just triple option football. Coach Steve might hate me for saying that, but it's option football. That's in the name of the run, pass, option. They've been around for a long time. So saying there are some people out there who are legitimately incredibly intelligent, like Coach Dearman. We mentioned him. I've been trying very hard to get him on our podcast. I've listened to a couple of his online clinics and asked him questions, and going to people who are willing to share, especially for a younger coach like myself who is considering themselves to be a lifelong learner, is amazing. And then you talk to some people, like Coach Steve mentioned, some people are like, well, I'll give you this amount of information, but if you pay me like this membership, like $35 a month, you'll get like the secret extra stuff that we do. And guess what? You pay that amount and it's really not that much extra. It's nothing that, a lot of times it's stuff that you already knew. And that's one of the reasons why everything I do is I'll probably never charge anybody for any podcasts or anything that I do. If I ever get into clinics like Coach Banstra, I'll never charge for it. It's free information. I'm just giving the platform to get knowledge out there, because I believe there are other people like myself out there, younger versions of myself who thought they knew everything, but they really don't, and they want to learn. That kind of drives me with my podcast.
Yeah, I think it's what you just talked about, both of you, and to finish your point, Coach Sheffer, it's I think it's I've always wondered, like when my oldest son was playing high school football, I volunteered with the head coach to say, I've got the technology at my house. I can put together a playbook. He would bring out sheets of paper with plays on them and stuff. And I said, I can put together a playbook, even if it's just doing it on PowerPoint. Back then we didn't have all these neat programs that you could do. And he wouldn't do it. And I'm like, look, the defense doesn't know what you're going to run, nor do they know the snap count. And those two things alone set you up for success if you're on offense. So we used to argue about it all the time, but in the 3 years I worked with him, he never would let me, he never would agree to and now, I mean, I know that, and they're probably not worth a whole lot anymore. They're older stuff, but I don't know how many copies of my playbooks I've given to new coaches, most of them youth football guys, but they got to start somewhere. And to me, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, the more you share and cross-fertilize, the better, because as you grow in level of sophistication, if you start at youth and go to middle school, high school, college, and so on, you're going to learn nuances with each of those levels. I have a friend that worked for 5 years on the Clemson staff and on the defensive side of the ball. And I can tell you, I mean, just chatting with him, I mean, it's his knowledge exploded being at Clemson. So, it's one of those things that I've never really understood. I'm going to be sensitive to you guys' time. I know it's late, and I did have one other question I want to get to, but understanding that I always joke, I'm a guy who takes 10 minutes to do a 3-minute closing. So it's one of those things, I kind of guard against. But when you look at what you value most about coaching and the relationships with athletes, I'd like each of you, if you would, to kind of spend a couple of minutes talking about, in your own value system, in engaging with coaches and athletes, for those things that you value, what stands out in your mind that really fuels you, really motivates you to, as you talked about, Coach Sheffer, being a lifelong learner, and Coach Steve, you talked about, the variety helps stimulate you in terms of having different people on and stuff. What do you guys value in those relationships that really kind of fuel you going forward? And since I started with Coach Steve, Coach Sheffer, I'll let you take this last question first.
That's a good question. Honestly, the things that I'll take with me, it's got, like you mentioned, it has to be the relationships. I honestly can't remember 2 years ago what our overall record was. I know we made it to the playoffs. I know that, but other than that, I remember the players. I remember the names of the players. I remember our defensive tackle Connor Sides. I remember our offensive lineman Tate Lang. You know, all of those kids. I'll remember those kids for a long time until my brain starts to go. So, which hopefully isn't anytime soon. And I still talk to them. You know, they still this community. These kids always come back into the community, and so they'll come back around the program because the program's always open to former players, and they'll come back and they'll talk to our players and they'll talk to us coaches, and we're always like, hey, how you doing? How's college going? Or how's your job going? And it's hearing that those players are doing well with themselves and that they are taking the lessons that we instilled in them through the program, not necessarily through the game of football itself, but through the program and through the leadership and the relationships that we have with those kids. And to know that they're doing well for themselves and that they are eventually going to pass on those lessons to other people. If you really think about it, no other profession except for maybe doctors or nurses, you know, I have to say nurses because my wife is a nurse, will affect a person's life as much as a teacher or a coach. They will not affect as many people as a teacher or a coach, except for the doctors and nurses. So you have to understand, and that motivates me to be the best that I possibly can every single day, because I never know. I might say something in a class offhand, like, okay, I can't talk to you right now or something like that. And that might affect a kid the rest of his day or the rest of his week. Or if I take the time for every kid and I try to give my best, that might make their day. And I might be the reason that kid shows up to school every day. And I never know it. But that's what motivates me to keep doing what I do. I can't picture myself doing anything else, to be totally honest. I've tried, and I just can't think of doing anything else. I didn't know I wanted to be a teacher and a coach until almost halfway through graduate school. But once I started doing it, and now that I've been in it for multiple years, I don't know if I could ever quit doing it. I told my wife the other day, it's like, if I ever retire from teaching, if my body is still physically able to do it, I am going to continue to coach as much as I possibly can. I'll be that old man on staff who does video if I have to. That's
awesome.
That's just how much I am ingrained in this, and I can't see myself doing anything else.
I love that answer. Coach Steve, how about you?
I'll probably end up piggybacking, but for me, building those relationships with coaches and players means everything. Because for me, in a small town, like I graduated with 76 people, my high school had 300 people. That's what we had was sports. And what my head football coach did for me, I knew at age of 16 years old, I said, I am coaching. Like I knew it because of what he did for me. I said, I want to reciprocate this to these kids. And there was a point where I said I had a bad experience 1 year coaching. I said, I'm never going to do it again, ever again. Then in the summer, you start doing this thing, you start itching, you're like, well, I got to coach. And I quickly realized I needed to help kids. I love helping kids. I love helping coaches. Nothing makes me happier than to help kids get through school or get through their sports, be there for them, helping a community with their sports program and helping coaches get through that. Like this COVID, the social stuff was Zoom. When I got to be around a new coaching staff, I immediately went up and started talking to them. I was like, this is my social time, and I'm going to help these coaches get through this time. And a couple years ago, I coached at a school that I guess you could consider lower income. That kind of opened my eyes to like, these kids need school and need sports and be around people. And that didn't click with me fully. I knew it, but it didn't click with me. And that was my 10th year coaching, maybe 10th, 11th year. Because I started doing since I was 18 years old. I was coaching. And that's when it all just connected. I knew it. It was in my brain and just connected. And I was like, oh my goodness. Like, you had to give kids peanut butter and jelly sandwiches before a game. They come up to you after the game, coach, can I get one more? That's their dinner. Like, that's what I had to realize. And so I knew you have to be there for those kids. Because no offense to a lot of teachers, there's the teacher side of somebody, then there's the coach. I guarantee you, because I coached at Charleston High School, I guarantee I knew more about those kids' lives that played football and basketball and track than the teacher did. Because I would get there early. I had the door open. There was a couch. And I said, if there's any problems, because I'm there early, because I was the offense coordinator at the time, I said, sit on the couch and we can talk about it. We could shut the door and talk about it. The open door policy. And that changed their world. They come talk to me about things. It could be something as much as, oh, my girlfriend and I got in an argument. All right, well, what happened? Like something like that. But building a relationship with coaches. I've been on different staffs. It means everything. It means everything to the kids, the community, the school. Like Coach Sheffer said, I wanted to coach since I was 16. I want to keep coaching until I can't no more. Till something forces me to stop, or I can't walk no more, or something. I'm going to do it until I can't.
That's awesome. I will tell you, I don't know how many athletes I coached. I've kept in touch with a lot of them, and that's what I love about social media. And sadly, in the last month and a half, I've gone to 2 ceremonies for kids that I coached who passed, one at 28 and one 2 days ago at 31. And it really, for what both of you have said, I commend you. I think it probably drives most coaches to some extent, but you don't necessarily take time to focus every day clearly on how short life really is. And, until that happens, and you have a kid, unfortunately pass early, it really opens my eyes, and it helped even boost my energy toward what I'm working on now, because I want to try and change some things. Even though I'm not actively coaching right now, it doesn't mean I can't use that as fuel. So I really appreciate it. I want one more time to highlight Coach Darrin Sheffer is the host of Armchair Coaching Podcast, and Coach Steve Kuchefski is the host of the Coach Steve Show. And if you guys would real quick, give a little plug for your shows, as well as if there is some place that people can find you, whichever social media platform you prefer, real quick before we end. So Coach Sheffer, if you don't mind, how do folks get a hold of you, or where do they find your show?
Well, our show, the Armchair Coaching Podcast, is on Anchor. That's the main podcast that we do, but it also comes up on Spotify. It's also on Apple Podcasts as well. It's actually, oh goodness, it's on quite a bit, because Anchor is so good at actually sharing all of your information. So currently we are on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Breaker, Overcast, Pocket Cast, Radio Public, and also Apple Podcasts as well. So we're available on nearly every podcast station that they have out there. And if you're interested in getting into contact with me, probably the best way to do that would be Twitter. That's the one social media that I know I'm always on. And so my handle for Twitter is, I honestly hardly ever look at it. I'm sorry about this, Coach. Just at Darrin Sheffer. So the @ DARRINSHEFFER. That's probably the best way that you can contact me. I think my DMs are open, so people have contacted me. Also, Coach Steve I'm going to do a quick little plug here. Coach Steve convinced me to start a secondary podcast that's going to be a lot less professional. It's going to be one it's going to be more of a variety show. It's going to be almost no sports, but if you're interested in listening, the name is unfortunate, because unfortunately I put it to a vote on Twitter, and I think some of the trolls influenced the vote. The name is going to be called Hipster's Delight.
I love it.
And the tagline is beards, bourbon, and BS. So, because if anyone's watching this, I have a relatively larger beard. I love talking about beards. I actually, don't get me wrong, don't think I'm an alcoholic or anything, but I do enjoy discussing whiskey, and I love researching the history behind it and understanding the process of making it. And so I'll probably talk about a little bit of both. And then the BS tagline is because I don't want to be restricted to just a certain topic, like the Armchair Coaching Podcast. It's very restrictive. I still love doing it, but it's like I can't really talk about all the other stuff on there. And so this one is one where, just like Coach Steve said, I don't have to focus on one single thing, but I am going to talk about beards, bourbon, and other BS because that's what I like to talk about.
I think that's awesome. We got to get you to come make a visit, because I live just south of Louisville, Kentucky. So the host, we're the home of fast horses and great bourbon. So when you're ready to visit a bunch of distilleries and increase your knowledge, let me know.
Absolutely.
Well, how about you, Coach Steve? What about people getting a hold of you?
I'm on Twitter too. My main one is at Coach_Steve72. I did make a Twitter for the Coach Steve Show. It's just at Coach Steve Show. That one I'm a little lazy on because it's hard to look at two Twitters. The podcast is on Spotify, Apple, Anchor, Pandora, iHeartRadio, Google, YouTube. It's the Coach Steve Show on YouTube too. And then I guess I did start another podcast, and people make fun of me all the time. It's called All Things Dead. I'm a huge Walking Dead fan. So I was like, why not just make a podcast just about that? So it's about Walking Dead, Fear the Walking Dead. So I'm a big nerd for that. Because I do Marvel and stuff on the other ones. I'm like, well, I can't do it all on the same one. Let me just start this one. And that's a little shameful plug, I guess. I was keeping that to myself.
I think it's awesome. Well, I am June 2nd, I am going to launch one called Changing You Sports. And I am trying to start a national movement. So I'm getting ready to go Facebook Live quite a bit. I'm using the community app. I'll be putting a phone number out there trying to grow that community, because I've been blessed to have a bunch of people, actually 14 so far, that run or help administer programs that help youth sports. And the problem is there's large pockets of folks that know about them in their communities, but not necessarily, parents from across the country. So we'll see what happens. But so we all three got a shameless plug for our other shows in there. That's awesome. Listen, guys, I really appreciate you all taking the time, late in the evening to do the recording. And I just wanted to say from me to you, thanks very much. I appreciate having you on For the Good of the Game. And if you're watching or listening to this, don't forget to subscribe. We always appreciate your comments and let us know how we can improve.